Hey, what's up? Zach here, and today I've got the all-new New Balance Kawhi 4, and these were, by far, the toughest shoes to cut open I think I've ever had on this channel. It was just a slog getting through these. But does that actually translate into build quality and to performance? Let's get into it. And thanks to New Balance for sending me 2 colors of the Kawhi 4 to check out. However, as always, this video is not sponsored by any means. All opinions, good, bad, and indifferent, are all my own. Now, starting off in the uppers, these things feel like a bear hug around your foot. They are super plush, padded, and comfortable, especially the tongue. Right where it actually meets your ankle, there's actually some double thickness padding right there in these 3 pods. Now, number 1, make sure that the laces do not irritate you up there. But number 2, it acts like, you know, what I tell people to do sometimes, like to put moleskin or padding under their tongue to stop slippage from going forward and backward. So in these, even though the heel counter is actually a little bit lower, the slippage in these is mild at best, and you're not sliding forward in the shoe either. Really serves 2 purposes, comfort as well as just holding you really steady in the shoe. And that's just a really small design element that it does really outsized work. Now the rest of the tongue is pretty decently padded. The forefoot also has some pretty generous padding. Now over top of that is a really intricate weave. There's a lot of TPU strands that go through. There's some textile as well. And you got this synthetic leather here on the one colorway, and then it almost looks like a plastic backing on the other colorway of these. So it's basically just a little bit more of a hard backing. Now that also goes up into the lace line. Now that lace line is actually outrigger, but it is reinforced from the inside. And you got these plastic pieces here on the second to most proximal lace eyelet. I thought those were gonna dig in a ton, but there's enough padding underneath of it, and they kind of sit in an area where I really don't feel them, which is nice. And it gives a little more stability to the ankle of the shoe, which, I mean, it's a nice little feature. The heel counter, though, is pretty interesting. It is a double heel counter. There is one internal, but then there is this kind of oddly shaped one here in the back that's just a plastic piece that goes across the shoe. Now, the interesting thing about these is it looks like they would be super breathable just from looking at the outside, looking at that weaving. However, look at the breathability test on these. They still did heat up 120.9 degrees, which when you put them on, you can pretty much guess, just because, like I said, they do feel pretty darn plush, and with all that padding, it's probably gonna come a little bit of heat trapping. You look at the breathability mapping of it, kind of tells the same story. Actually, the tongue does breathe pretty well, and this is gusseted, but it is just these pretty small elastic gussets, so there is a lot of room for air to flow through the shoe. Thing I found is that they did not feel like they were very heat trapping, but I'm guessing on, you know, a little bit of a hot summer day, they're not going to be like some of the shoes we've seen recently that are just, you know, air is just flowing through them. So you're getting a ton of comfort and padding, but you're probably going to sacrifice just a little bit there in terms of the heat and moisture retention. Now, speaking of that, if you look at the upper durability test on these things, 10-second highest grit sandpaper, that's the one thing about these. It does get through that synthetic leather. It does not get into the TPU. Now, you do have some exposed foam here, some exposed fuel cell, but you do have a little bit of a drag guard. So I would say if you're the right type of dragger, if you're more on the tips, you should be fine. But if you're more of a true everter when you drag, you know, your whole foot kind of everts, then you probably can look for this to start getting a little weird on outdoor courts. And getting into the midsole on the teardown, this was, like I said, quite the teardown. This just took me absolutely forever to get into. Number 1, the rubber on the outsole, pretty strong too, but the midsole with that energy arc that they have, which is basically just a quasi almost full length shank on these things, it kind of spans out into the midsole. Now this is sandwiched here between 2 layers of fuel cell. And the one thing I noticed about this fuel cell is it's a lot more plush feeling. It almost feels like fresh foam X under there, but maybe just, you know, a little bit more plasticky feeling under there. But definitely not like some of the other fuel cells I've seen recently, specifically in the tennis space. Said a lot more plush feeling, almost like the fuel cell version of Fresh Foam X. That's what it feels like underfoot, a little bit more plush, but it also feels very bottom light. These shoes they're not the lightest things in the world, but most of the heft in them actually, to me, comes from the uppers of these shoes as well as the pretty thick outsole tread. So honestly, they don't feel all that bottom heavy. And the interesting thing is, you look at the bounce height test on them, comes in at 36 centimeters in the heel and then 36 in the forefoot. And what I like about this is that, you know, New Balance put a lighter, a little bit more plush feeling foam in there, but then they sandwiched that shank in between those layers. So you're getting the plush ride, but also there's an exoskeleton to this. If you look at the lateral side, that carbon fiber actually comes up here on the lateral side. So there is a little bit of caging to that foam. And on the outside, it actually feels really stiff. That's still the fuel cell. It's just cased on the outside there. So I like that combination where you get the softer ride, but then you get the shank of the shoe that's stress shielding it. So you're getting the best of both worlds. You're giving that diving board effect of that near full length shank, and you're also getting the soft and plush feeling and lighter feeling underfoot of the fuel cell. And getting into the outsole tread, this one was pretty interesting to see not only on the viewing box, but also on the grip test ramp, and then just kind of, in real life. This is a very linear pattern, right? There is a radius to this, right? But for all intents and purposes, when you're using them, this is a pretty flat line tread. It is pretty narrow as well, these treads. Now the durometer or the rear foot comes in at a 20, and then the forefoot, whether it be the translucent rubber or the dyed rubber, that comes in at a 14.5. So it is softer rubber up there. Now, I did notice initially side-to-side grip as well as front-to-back grip. You can even see it on the viewing box. This rubber does really kind of meld in with the surface, does interact really nice. But it's going front to back that it does its best work, right? That's where the gapping of the rubber really creates that grabbing effect on the ground. Look at it on the grip test ramp, doesn't slip till 42 degrees, which is pretty darn good. Now that is the dyed rubber, the translucent slipped at 38 degrees. That is pretty similar to what we've seen on the Fresh Foam BB with its dyed versus translucent. That dyed rubber just has a little bit more grab to it on the New Balance line. Now what I did notice is when they start picking up dust though, that's when the side-to-side grip starts going a little bit and you start getting a little bit more forgiveness. It's not terrible because it is cased, a little bit. So you are still getting grip, but definitely not as tacky as it is when you're going front to back. So when you go north to south, even when there is dust on this shoe, just because of the orientation of it and because of those two different compounds of rubber, you're still able to grab going forward. So I think as long as you keep these wiped down, the grip is pretty nimble, pretty confident. You can transition step pretty well. It's not as confidence inducing as the Fresh Foam BBV2. You're trading that real rugged grip for more nimble and easy flowing type grip. And taking a look at the speed ratio, the Kawhi 4s, they come in at a 2.26, shank score of 0.3, bumps that up to a 2.56. Almost think that's kind of underselling them a little bit just because their quickness and their actual coast-to-coast speed really match up, right? This shoe has a lot of dynamic speed, right? Once the shoe starts getting activated, once you start putting energy into this shoe, that's when it's giving you the most back. But honestly, it feels really quick and nimble like a lightweight shoe and you're trying to just, make quick side steps and things like that. But it also has that crazy first step launch. But then it also feels pretty easy to get from coast to coast too. So a lot of times in shoes, you sacrifice the quickness, the nimble movement for some of the coast-to-coast movement or some of the containment. And then some shoes, the opposite is true. Whereas in these, their side-to-side movement and speed, and then their coast-to-coast movement is kind of the same. So it's nice. You don't have to sacrifice any of them. It is kind of the complete package in terms of if you want a quick shoe for really any situation you get yourself into. And on the outsole durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. Yeah, not even a millimeter of damage in the rear foot or the forefoot rubber, which is the lower durometer. So the one thing about these though, on outdoor courts, I'm sure a lot of you know where I'm going with this, is the tread is just thin, right? So if you're a dragger or a slider, you're probably gonna start to lose some of the best parts of this shoe on an outdoor court. If you don't do that, if you have a little more fluid footwork, if you're not really, producing a lot of friction, then I think they should be okay. But I would still say these things do their very best work on an indoor hardwood court. Now, in terms of fit, these things actually fit pretty generous like a lot of New Balance shoes do. They come in at 9.4 centimeters for a men's size 11. Interesting thing is these do have a little bit more of an in-flare at 11 degrees, which I think is what makes them feel a little bit more lively versus some shoes where, yeah, they have a wide fit and they're also pretty straight, so they can feel a little clunky. These ones don't. So, a narrow foot, I think, can go down a half size. A 2E and a 4E, if these do come out in a 2E and 4E, you can just go true to size, but I'd say a 2E still could go true to size. Same with a medium, and a 4E in standard, I'd probably try just to go up one half size. However, you can go up one full size on these because the lockdown on these is so good, especially once you've broken them in. In terms of the snake bitten foot in these, I love the fact you can throw an orthotic in this and there's enough padding in the tongue and enough room in there that you can still lock them down, so you can even get, you know, more bulky custom orthotic in these as well. But even on their own for the snake bitten foot, because the rear foot's pretty stable, because of the shank in there, you know, they do protect a lot, you know, really no matter what you're bringing to the table. And you know, sometimes with fuel cell shoes, they can be a little bit more shock inducing up the leg versus Fresh Foam X, right? I mean, traditional fuel cell, I mean, it's not bad. It's just the setup in these ones, definitely a step up in the fuel cell department. Like I said, almost getting up there to where the Fresh Foam X line is. Yeah, the Fresh Foam X to me, still a little bit better to me for those snake bites in your foot, but this is quite a step up, you know, kind of getting into that conversation for sure in terms of a fuel cell line shoe. And speaking of the fuel cell and that shank kind of protecting the bottom of your foot, you know, the playability of these, it's interesting because you do lose a little bit of ground feel on these versus other shoes that I've had with fuel cell foam in them. You really can get an intimate contact with the ground, especially in the forefoot. Whereas in these ones, you get a little more protection from the ground, but you lose a little bit of that tactile fine sensation that you might be used to in some previous fuel cell shoes. But because these are so nimble and these shoes just allow a feeling of confidence to, you know, kind of, you know, bounce around a little bit more in these, I found that the performance of these, to me, was definitely a step up from previous fuel cell shoes, not just for their fit and their characteristics in terms of what I look for, you know, in a clinical setting, you know, as a foot doctor, but in terms of on-court performance, that setup, I just feel like a kangaroo underfoot, right? It just really feels like you can get up off the ground so easily, even from compromised positions. You're getting up from one leg, right? Like you're trying to, you know, get back for those weird jump shots, getting up over somebody else for a jump shot, or even just making a quick step back to try to create some separation. I think these ones, in terms of someone looking for a little bit more speed, a little bit more nimble side to side movement, but also a shoe that you can get up for layup and just get up into the air over and over again on these, this is going to be a shoe that is kind of good for all those things. And I think with the Kawhi line, right, it really is that tweener shoe that I think a lot of people are looking for, that does everything pretty well, but I think what it does best is, like I said, give you that feeling of just a little bit easier hop on these. Like I said, even though they're not the lightest things on the planet, they feel lighter underfoot. And so I think a lot of people that are looking for speed, containment, but also easy and quick snap out of a shoe, I think are really, really going to like these. And I'm interested to see kind of where people fall in the line of this one, the two-way, the Fresh Foam BBV2, because, like, I mean, New Balance, I'm sure you've watched some of my videos, I mean, they've come out with some pretty darn good shoes recently. So, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these, especially because when you look at them, they don't look like super rugged lateral side-to-side shoes, but yet the containment on them is so good. They do kind of disguise a lot of their best characteristics in this shoe, which I think is pretty interesting. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. You know, which one of these are you going for, if any, in the NB line, or are you going with something else completely? Let me know down below. And if you do want to see the older sibling to the Kawhi 4, the New Balance Fresh Foam BBV2, the one I've been comparing it to this whole video, make sure you click into this video up above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam, whatever kind of formulation of fuel cell foam that might be. I'll see you somewhere in Sneakerverse.